everyone. It's good to see everyone here. I hope as we begin this lecture that you will continue to make yourself comfortable, heading off to the restroom if and when needed, or getting a second or third or fourth bowl of soup if you need. But I want to welcome you all. Once again, this is now the third part 3 of our Lenten lecture series. It was meant to be, I will remind you of this, it was meant to be part 4. But part 3, one part was canceled due to infirmity on my part. So we have condensed this lecture series from 5 lectures down to 4. And Joseph handled us last week, so I want to thank my colleague and friend for stepping in and doing that. I've heard nothing but rave reviews. I hope that's not a sign from the divine. I might, hey Sally, or Barbara, you'll close that? Great, thank you. Tonight's lecture is, if you remember, the title of this whole lecture series is on an emerging Christianity for the 21st century. And tonight we're going to focus on the Bible. So let me review just a little bit of kind of where we are at this point in talking about an emerging Christianity. What we're really talking about is a new or an emerging paradigm, an emerging way of thinking about our faith. And I want to remind everybody, and I want to be very clear, this is not, none of what we're talking about here is a rejection of the traditional ways in which we understand God or Jesus or the Bible or the human condition, but it is a different way and an emerging way. So this is not meant to be mutually exclusive or a particularly as a critique of a traditional understanding, but I do want to present this as there are different ways of approaching our faith, and they're all viable, they're all true, they all provide access and direction toward God. So as we review, just to kind of where we are for the last couple lectures, we've talked about God in ways that are not theistic, which is to say we were talking about God as the more, as the encompassing spirit in whom everything exists, and God as a connection that courses through all of creation. And because it's a connection that courses through all creation, there's a lot about God that deals with relationships, and particularly about love as a connecting force. And one way to think of it, one of my favorite metaphors that I shared is that it's like being in an ocean and we're just swimming in God. God is all around us. We also talked a little bit briefly about the human condition. The traditional understanding in Christian terms is that we are rooted in sin. We are rooted in original sin from the beginning. And that this sin creates distance from God. If you're being particularly old-fashioned and theistic, you could say this angers God, who then needs to be appeased. And that's traditionally understood to require sacrifice. A sacrifice is what's required for us to have our sin removed and our restored relationship with God. So now, but in an emerging paradigm, an emerging way of thinking about the human condition, you can think, well, I don't know that from an evolutionary standpoint, maybe that we are mired in sin from the beginning doesn't seem maybe a particularly helpful framework. But one other way to talk about this is that you can think of us as if God is everywhere and is the connection to us all, and it's rooted in love, that we have been unconnected, severed, or cut off, or perhaps are even unaware of our connection to divine. That's another way of thinking about it. And if we think about it, the human condition in that way as being cut off from the source of life from which we all come, then instead of sin and sacrifice, we begin to talk about maybe other biblical references like exile and return as a way of framing our path. And it reminds me that in the book of Acts, the early Christians, before they were called Christians, considered themselves to be on the way. And I love that. I think that kind of gets to this emerging paradigm, that we are on the path to rediscovering our connection to God. Well, if you've got that view of God and you've got that view of the human condition, that also can have an effect on how you think of Jesus. If you lean away from the thought that God needs a sacrifice to be okay with us, then it does beg the question, how do we understand Jesus? Because in the traditional understanding of Jesus, Jesus is that, a sacrifice. That's the main purpose of Jesus's time on earth, was to be a sacrifice so that we can be okay with God. But in this emerging paradigm, if we think of ourselves as estranged from the root of all being, then what we really need is a teacher and a mystic who understands God, and a healer and a movement leader. And that's who Jesus, in an emerging paradigm, sort of starts to becomes that. So we begin to think of Jesus as a historical figure who guides us in our reconnection with the divine. He's certainly a leader who is the pathfinder along the way we travel, and whose primary message, and I think most biblical scholars would agree with this, whose primary message is not about how we get to heaven, but about God's kingdom on earth, establishing God's kingdom here in real time, with this emphasis that Jesus had on fairness and justice. So that's kind of an overview of where we were for the last couple lectures. And today, as I mentioned earlier, we're going to focus on the Bible, how we understand the Bible in this emerging paradigm of Christianity. Now, so let's review a little bit about, and some of you probably, well, maybe I'll even ask, what are the traditional understandings of this book? Where does it come from? Comes from God. It is the Word of God, and it comes from God. Right. Yep. And I think that traditional understanding, I think many of us still carry parts of that, or maybe even all of that with us, that this book is, it is a divine, in the traditional understanding, this is a divine product. Okay? It comes from God. It may have come through human brains and human hands, but God guided those brains and hands in the writing of this book. And therefore, because of that, in and of itself, it must be considered holy and sacred, and taken to be literally true. And to even begin to doubt the veracity of any part of this is, tantamount to trouble, right? Because you're doubting God at this point in that understanding. And that, of course, then in the traditional way in which we often approach Christianity, of like the whole point is to get into heaven, that now threatens that a little bit. So there is this implicit threat that we have to understand this as the Word of God, inerrant, literally true, and if we don't, well, then we risk our own souls. So let's take a deep breath. And realize that is not the only way to approach the Bible. That we can view this wonderful book in a totally different way that nonetheless deepens our relationship with the divine in a profound way. And so we're going to explore that. And I think the three main components of thinking about the Bible, if we're not going to think about it as literally true, and as the inerrant and dictated Word of God, we're going to look at this. Let's remember this is a library of books, 66 books plus others, the Apocrypha, they're kind of like half in the library. That we're going to look at this from a historical perspective, a metaphorical perspective, and a sacramental or sacred perspective. So first, a bit about viewing the book as a historical set of documents, which it is. This is the product of two communities, two historical communities, ancient Israel and the early Christian movement. Most of the books in the Old Testament, the Hebrew part of the Bible, were written in the 500 years preceding Jesus. And although they refer to times before that, they were probably written or came into their final written form in the 500 years before Jesus. And then, of course, the New Testament, which was written by the early Christian movement and that community around the Mediterranean. So we have 66 books, probably well over 100 different authors over the time period of close to 2,500 and maybe even as much as 3,000 years ago that came to write this. So the truth of the matter is this is a human product. Human people wrote this. This does not deny the reality of God. In fact, it very much affirms the reality of God, because every book in here is, while not dictated by God, is in response to God, in the way that we might write something in response to having an experience of God, or our desire to be closer to God, or our understanding of how God works in the community. So the Bible is really a wonderful human response to being in communion with God. So it is a historical document too, in the sense that, this is going to sound funny. This book was not written to you or to me. This is a collection of writings that were written to a specific audience a few thousand years ago, whether they were Jews or early Christians. And so these different books of the Bible tell us how these communities saw things. They tell us how they saw their life with God. And these are stories about God's involvement in their lives. And of course, we have ethical teachings, we have laws, we have prayers and practices, and we have deep wisdom about how to live and how to live out one's hopes and dreams. So the point I'm trying to, at this point, I'm probably beating it to death, is that these stories were written in a certain context and in a certain time, and it uses language and concepts of the cultures in which it took shape. And for instance, St. Paul was Jewish, but a Roman citizen, very well educated and fluent in Greek philosophy. And it's very helpful to know that because he writes in a way, and you have to know that Paul's early attempts to proselytize to Jews fell completely flat. He got nowhere with the Jewish population. However, the Hellenistic cultures around the Mediterranean ate him up. They loved him because he would begin to explain Christ in ways that had echoes of Plato and Socrates, which he knew. So knowing the culture in which, so Paul was writing to Greeks and Romans, most of the time non-Jewish people, all over to the Mediterranean. It's helpful to know that and to try to hear what Paul would have said, knowing what his audience knew. So, and you all have heard my sermons enough to know that I think strongly that this is a wonderful way to approach the Bible, because it takes the Bible seriously, with the understanding that it was written for people who lived then, and the importance of seeing and understanding what those words would have meant if you had been in that situation. For instance, I'll just give you another example of this. The second half of the book of Isaiah, it's wonderful, it's one of the largest prophetic works we have. The second half of that book is written to the Jews who were in exile. They had been forcibly removed from their homeland and were living in a foreign land. And once you know that the entirety of that second half of Isaiah is written to people who have been chucked out of their homes and are yearning to come home, it brings that passage alive. It just helps you understand and see, oh, this is speaking to people who are yearning to come home. And then we can begin to really feel the true impact of those words. So now, this is where I'm going to tell a little story on Joseph here in a second. I promised him I would. But one of the things that about viewing the Bible as historical, as a historical document, it does beg the question that are we reading history? And the answer is not in the way that we think of it. Asking the question, did the reported events really happen or happen in the way that they are described in the Bible? I love that question. I'm always asking that question. The answer is usually not quite happen that way. But ultimately, it may not be the most important question. And that's going to get me to my second point. But first I want to tell a story about Joseph, which will drive this home. Joseph and I have a lot of wonderful conversations, and they often, a few of them, more than a few of them, have gone like this. He comes into my office and waxes this wonderful, powerful, innermost feelings about this passage that we're reading from the Gospel of John, and how it has moved him and how it has moved Christians throughout the centuries, and it is just a deeply powerful, moving passage, to which I reply, yeah, I don't think it happened. Which is true, but both are true, right? It may not have been historically accurate, the way John wrote his gospel, but Joseph is the protagonist in this situation because he's right. Even if it wasn't historically accurate, there is a much deeper, more profound truth of which it speaks that John was trying to communicate and that Joseph heard, and I, in my wanting to just only believe things that are historically accurate, was unable to hear. So that brings me to this second understanding. We understand the Bible as historical, but it's also important to think of it as metaphorical. What do I mean by that? I mean, we learned in middle school that metaphors, are this figure of speech in which you make sort of a non-literal comparison between something and something else. Sally used a brutal metaphor earlier today about solving a problem by ripping the Band-Aid off before you have to amputate.
The second time.
We both got a good chuckle. What a good metaphor that was. And of course, all metaphors break down at some point. But the point is, and the way I've heard this best expressed, is that there is the literal meaning of whatever passage we happen to be reading from the Bible. But invariably, there is a deeper, more important, and more profound metaphorical meaning, the truth behind that biblical passage that really is what is to be focused on. So that you almost can get to a place where you don't have to decide, or you can kind of pick and choose. You can say, well, I believe that happened, as if I could have videotaped it, or I don't believe that happened, as if I couldn't have videotaped it. But regardless of whether or not you could have videotaped the passage, there is a profound truth there to be discovered. So I'll give you a couple examples of this. I'll give you three. So the first example is throughout the Psalms and throughout the prophetic work, we often hear of God as having hands and feet and ears and eyes. This is kind of an easy one. Of course, we know that God does not have literal hands and feet and ears and eyes, but we say that God does. Why? The Bible says that. Why? Because we know that there's a truth to the fact that the divine, that God moves and feels and hears and sees and senses us in relationship. And so we talk about that metaphorically with God's eyes and ears and hands and feet. Another example, again, this is sort of drawing the distinction of two different questions. Is that story true? And did it happen that way? We think of those two things as meaning the same thing, but they don't. There was a famous Catholic priest who in a sermon said, the Bible is true, and some of it even happened. So that's kind of gets at this. So like think about some of those stories from the Old Testament, the creation stories. There are two, by the way. And there's Adam and Eve and the Garden of Eden, and Cain's murder of Abel, and Noah and the flood. And I remember coming to this realization, and it was a hard one, so I hope I'm not breaking, I don't know how many eggs I'm breaking right now, but this is not human history, okay? These are metaphorical narratives. Now, the ancient Israelites might have believed them, but they are metaphorical narratives, and they carry in them profound truths about human nature and our relationship. I mean, they're myths, but they teach us that God is the creator of all, that creation is good, indeed very good, that we are created in the image of God, and that somehow we live our lives east of Eden, which is to say, something ain't right. It's not all good. Things are imperfect. And they speak of our yearning to return to God, returning to Eden, of returning to the all good, of being with God. That's an example of, is the story true? Yeah, it is true. Those things are true. Did it happen that way? Well, we don't even really have to answer that. We could even just leave that alone. Getting a little closer to home, and Sally and I heard this one about Jesus, and this is one that people get a little testy about. But the birth narratives around Jesus is sort of another one that comes up kind of often. There is a feeling among many Christians that one must believe that Jesus was born of a virgin, and that there were wise men who came from the east. They followed a star, that angels came to shepherds in the countryside and sang to them in the night sky, and that Herod murdered the firstborn in Israel in his attempt to prevent Jesus' rise to power. Again, I'm not even going to ask if you feel that that's actually happened or it didn't. But I am going to say that if we take a metaphorical approach to this, setting aside whether or not we could have videotaped any of that, we end up with some wonderful truths. We end up with these stories affirming that Jesus was of God, connected to God in a powerful and unique way, and that no one around him had ever experienced anything like his connection before. And with that light above that the wise men followed, that we understand Jesus to be the light of the world, the true light that enlightens every person. And that with those wise men coming from the east, well, they obviously weren't Jewish, so that this story is teaching that Jesus is for everyone, Jew and Gentile. And with those angels singing to shepherds, again, that his message was for everyone and was for particularly those who were marginalized, off in the countryside, the poorest of the poor, taking care of their flocks on the hillsides at night. And with the murder of the firstborn, there's no historical record that Herod ever did that. I can't imagine that he would have murdered his own people in that way. But this story affirms that Jesus, remember Moses, same thing happened to Moses, right? He was put in that basket and shoved down the Nile so that he could avoid being murdered as the firstborn by the Pharaoh. And this story then tells us that Jesus is the new Moses, here to deliver us out of that which enslaves us to the promised land that God has promised for us. So these are the metaphorical meanings of these stories, and they allow us, if we can approach these stories this way, they have so much power. And they are the true meaning behind them, and you can set aside whether or not you think they could have been videotaped. And it really, the literal aspect of this starts to lose its the requirement for its belief. All right, so I talked about the Bible as being historical, as metaphorical, and I'm going to spend just the last little bit talking about this as sacred and as sacramental. And I'll draw a subtle distinction here, but it's both. We have a colleague, Greg Pennington, who when he really gets preaching, he has a big, thick Bible, and I love it. He sits there and he wags it at his congregation. So, anyway, I always want to do that to you. So, okay. So let's, down to brass tacks, if we're going to say, and we did just say that this was a human creation, and that you don't have to believe it literally, you can understand this metaphorically, the smarty pants, which I am, would ask, well, okay, is it even sacred then? What's so great about this? What makes this Bible sacred? Why should we understand this as something holy? Well, it is sacred. But for reasons that are of human origin and of a historical process, and not as a consequence of its divine origin, but because of its human origin. I mean, remember these documents, these were letters and stories that were told. They weren't sacred when they were written. Paul was not writing sacred text to the Corinthians. It was only after that community got that letter and loved it and read it thousands and thousands of times and copied it and mailed it all around the Mediterranean, that after a few decades, it became understood. Like this is a sacred text. This is a text that is very important to us and holds us together and teaches us how to be good Christians. And that process, which takes decades and even centuries, is really what makes this sacred. Because they have been declared sacred by the Jewish community, by the ancient Israel community, and by the ancient Christians, the early Christian communities. That's what made it sacred. It took 5 centuries for the Old Testament to become sacred. It took 3 centuries. It wasn't until around the time of Constantine in the late 300s that the final form of the 66 books of the Bible became codified into, okay, that's now the Bible. There were lots of books that had been sort of on the fence, whether or not they were in or out. So it took, 5 centuries for the Old Testament, 3 centuries for the New Testament to establish that these are the sacred texts. These are the texts that have the most meaning for our community. And so they're sacred both by status. We know this as Christians. In the Christian church, this is the most important collection of documents that we know. This is it. The most important collection of documents. They're sacred for that. But they're sacred in their function too. This is the foundational document of the Christian church. Without this, let's be honest, without the Bible, Christianity crumbles and falls away. It is a cornerstone. It is a pillar of the faith. It's sacred in that sense. And it's the identity document. It's the stories and the vision that come from here that identify who we are and what our life with God is all about. And it's sacred by the fact that it contains a lot of wisdom. It contains a lot of guidance for us in how we order our lives, both in ourselves and in our communities. It's sacred for that reason. So it's sacred, but one of the other things is that you can say about the Holy Bible is that it's sacramental. And I'll draw a distinction with that. And we're now getting way off into Zach's head on some of this, so I'll just forewarn you on that. But when we think about sacraments, in the Episcopal Church, we think about we have 2 sacraments officially. We have baptism and we have Holy Communion. And we think about, what are those sacraments? Well, they are human creations. We made up the rite of baptism. And Jesus gave us the practice of Holy Communion, but we practice those as humans. And what are they? Sacraments are always multi-layered. There's always, many different layers of interpretation and blessings going on in this. I mean, so on one hand, we understand sacraments to be a place where we encounter God. That it is a place where God's presence can be uniquely felt. And I think that that's true. Even though we would say this is a human creation, the Bible is a place where we can encounter God. We read about others in our past who have encountered God and what that was like. And we learn how to be receptive to encountering God by reading the Bible. So in that sense, the Bible is sacramental. It is a sacrament. It is a place where we can encounter God. The other way that I interpret the sacraments, both baptism and the Eucharist, is if we're back to understanding ourselves along a path, along the way, we have been exiled and are now returning to God. It's a long journey. It takes a lifetime. And we need a lot of nourishment. You got to sustain yourself on that. And the sacraments are gifts that sustain us on our way. You can think about, one of the wonderful ways of thinking about the Eucharist is the bread and wine is just a weekly nourishment, a weekly shot in the arm that allows us to continue our path. It reminds us of our connection to God. We encounter God that way, and we're nourished by it and encouraged by it. I think that's a wonderful way to think about the Bible, that this is something that provides us nourishment, much the same way as the Eucharist does. These stories and these readings, this wisdom, these psalms, these proverbs, this prophetic work nourishes our heart and soul and encourages us along our way. And the last way, again, this is sort of a multi-layered approach to understanding what a sacrament is. I'd sometimes think of sacraments as road signs. This is sort of like the nourishment too, but in this sense that road signs that point us to God. This way to God. That way to trouble. This way to God. Everything about what we try to do in church, and I think the lessons that we read in the Bible, that's really a wonderful way to think about it, that all of those authors, the hundreds of authors that wrote these sacred texts, were trying to provide us road signs. This way to God. Go this way. If you go that way, you might run into some trouble, because we tried. So head this way. I think we humans, we get mixed up sometimes, and I think sometimes I think we end up trying to worship the road sign as opposed to follow it. Follow the sign in the direction that it points. So that's kind of how the Bible is both sacred. It's sacred because we have made it sacred. It took centuries of our communities to establish that these are the most important documents to us. And they're sacramental because they nourish us and they point us in the right direction. And they are a place where we can encounter God. And the Bible is all of that. Okay, I have gone on way too long, so I'm going to wrap this up. In short, so what? So in this emerging paradigm, we can understand that the Bible is human in origin, and it's okay to think that. It's sacred in its status and in its function. It can be read literally, but its true power is when it's read metaphorically. And when we use it as a sacrament for nourishment, as a sacrament for guidance, as a place where we can encounter God, that's where the power of this book comes to the fore. So taking all of that together, what we realize about the Bible is that it's not about believing every last word of this as assenting to it to be factually true, but that this book is guiding us in our relationship to God, always into our deeper relationship to God. We can't do it without that. We can't do it without it. So next week, our final lecture. We're going to wrap this all up. And so next week we will focus on the role of the church and how we live our lives as Christians in this emerging paradigm of Christianity. With that, I'm going to have a drink and answer any questions. Not seeing any tomatoes.
How do we discern the difference?
Yeah.
I mean, really?
Well, say more. Keep talking.
Well, I'm still trying to get past what I learned in Sunday school as a child.
Yep.
And you know where that is. And the transition is hard.
Yeah.
How do you, I guess it's an individual thing. We pick and choose what we can, huh? I don't know.
Well, honestly, I think this is easier than you might think. I don't think you have to make this hard. Because ultimately, you don't have to make decisions about what to pick and choose. I think the most important thing is just to always ask yourself, what is the deeper meaning of this passage?
Keep an open mind.
Yeah. What is the deeper meaning? If you have doubts that Jesus walked on water, fine. What is the deeper meaning of that passage? What is the gospel writer trying to tell us about Jesus and about our life with Jesus and about our life with God by saying that Jesus walked on water? We don't even have to answer whether or not he did it or not. Just keep asking yourself, what's the deeper meaning of that? And I think that's the right guide and approach. Yes, Joseph?
When we look at things, when we read the stories and we take a look at them literally, it minimizes its actual effect. And to use an example, the three wise men actually come to see Jesus. Well, that's just a photograph that they were there and gave him a present. But when you ask the question, well, what does that actually mean? What is the lesson here? And then you think about how long it would have taken for those guys in the east, wherever in Babylon or wherever they were, to recognize that there was this star. How many conversations did they have to decide what it meant? And how long did it take for them to prepare their trip for this visit? Who did they meet and what happened along the way? To me, that makes it blossom. Because that's realizing entire populations were affected by Jesus' birth. It wasn't just those three guys. It was everybody who got him ready for it. And that's what gets me excited when I come down to his office.
Does that answer your question?
But and it may have started with some of that. And then among, not the Old Testament, but it would have to be a New Testament where once they canonized all of,
Yeah.
all the books,
Yeah,
that it began to take on.
yeah, I would think so. That would be 3rd century,
Yeah,
even 4th century.
4th century.
I wonder if it was called anything else before?
What's that?
I wonder if it was called something else before?
Well, I think before, it would have just been,
Scrolls.
yeah, people just had collections, and incomplete books. You could imagine certain Christian communities would have had, they would have had a copy of Paul's letter to the Corinthians and a copy of Mark's gospel and, a few of the scrolls of Isaiah and Ezekiel or something like that. They wouldn't have had it all. And it really wasn't until first off, you had to get from scrolls to a codex, which is a book, like what an actual book, this is a codex, right? It has a cover and books and whatnot. So they had to figure out how to put writings into that form first, away from the scrolls. So, and then, I don't know. I mean, I really think it must have been around the 3rd or 4th century that all this came.
Did we have a complete Bible before Gutenberg?
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. But before Gutenberg, they would have been handwritten and they would have been handwritten in Latin for the most part.
There, you could have translated.
Yes.
I guess I want to hark back quickly, not a lengthy thing. We had a series, evening series, where we looked at icons and studied them, and one had to do with the birth,
Uh-huh.
with the nativity.
Yep.
And it struck me when we were talking about that, you were to envision yourself as somebody in the story. Who were you and who?
Yeah.
And it occurred to me while listening to that, I didn't feel like I was anybody in the story, but that there were many people left out. This teenager didn't give birth to her first baby all by herself, and Joseph didn't help her because culturally that would be very wrong for the male to do that. So there were other women. They heard somebody was screaming in birth, and it was a young woman, and they came and helped. There were people who were left out of the story. The story is no less beautiful, but there's a lot in these. They're just talking about a couple of the main characters, but there's a whole cast behind those. And that was really helpful for me.
We've got more explanation.
Okay.
It's a 4th century usage. John Chrysostom and his homilies on Matthew, delivered between 386 and 388 CE, is believed to be the first writer to use the Greek phrase "ta Biblia" to describe both the Old and New Testaments together.
Okay.
When was that?
Well, we were right. Heck, we made a pretty good guess.
4th century. John Chrysostom.
You all have heard of the Qumran community, which is the community that had the Dead Sea Scrolls, that huge discovery from 1947, I think. And that the way that community was really indicative of how libraries of sacred texts work, and it basically was a library of scrolls, and so they had, in that library, there were many of the scrolls that were sacred to the Israelites at the time, Isaiah and others, but they also had scrolls that were not ultimately part of what we think of as the Old Testament canon. They were outside of that, but they were sacred to that community too. So that was sort of, up through the time of Jesus, certainly, and then you think in the centuries, a couple centuries that followed, that's really the way many communities of faith handled this. They kept, they might have had the Torah, but that's just the first 5 books of the Old Testament, right? And then they would have had different scrolls of, the prophets, Psalms, Proverbs, and then probably some that weren't part of the canon. there too.
Who decided what to leave out?
Yeah, centuries of debate on that. Yeah. And, we're aware of other gospels that are out there, some early and some late. I think I've made reference to the Gospel of Mary, the Gospel of Peter, there's the Gospel of Judas,
Thomas.
of course, the Gospel of Thomas. We're waiting for volume 2 on that.
Yes. It's coming.
The Gospel of Thomas was really early. That was written in the 1st century, but yet didn't make it into the canon. It's not part of our Bible. The Gospels of Peter and Mary, they think those were more 2nd century writings, and so it's a little more understandable why they didn't make it into the canon. But there's all throughout those first few centuries of the Christian communities, they are arguing over texts. And John Chrysostom and all those early bishops are sniping at each other and arguing with each other.
A human story.
Well, yes. And one of the things that happens, if you're familiar with some of the history of the Roman Empire, the Constantine in the 4th century is considered sort of the bridge between the Roman Empire and the Holy Roman Empire. And the Roman Empire had fallen into such disarray that Constantine really needed another way to hold it all together. And he thought Christianity could be that way. He was very pragmatic about this. And so what he does is he kind of makes the decisions, all right, Christianity is what's going to hold all this together now, but the Christians are not agreeing about anything. Really, he gets kind of miffed about this. And so that's why he pays for the Council of Nicaea. He basically convenes all the bishops from all over the Mediterranean, from Egypt, Alexandria, everywhere, and gets them all in one spot and says, you guys are not leaving until we agree on this. And he gets them largely to agree. And so it's at that time, you get the Nicene Creed, but also they make some decisions around the biblical canon at the same time, too. They didn't agree on everything there. They had to come back a couple more times. They kept revising. But it really was that, there was under the, Constantine was a Roman emperor. There was always the threat of violence, which is always pretty motivational. Other questions? Thomas, when can we expect volume 2?
I was just thinking about that. Pondering, so to speak.
We'll stay tuned. Perhaps next year's Lenten lecture. Perhaps. Kept you all a little bit late. Thank you for staying.
Thank you.
Okay, we'll see you next week for our last exciting installment.